Hello, I'm Grant Bartley from Philosophy Now magazine, and you're listening to the Philosophy Now radio show. I'm here with John Holroyd, who's a teacher of philosophy at St Dunstan's College, and he teaches the International Baccalaureate, and he's got some of his students here, and they're going to debate ethical issues and their contemporary application, starting with the riots, and we'll hopefully go on then to the consider the ethics of the Dale Farm travellers situation. So, John?
Thank you. Well, I have a number of students here who are in the sixth form in Year 13, and I have Amy and Nicole, Layla, Lawrence and David. What I thought that we would do would be to look at some particular aspects of the riots and the Dale Farm travellers situation that's recently been in the news, and to explore, with the use of some theories about ethics, really what's best to do in certain situations. So to start us off, I've asked a couple of students who are here to introduce some of these theories. And Amy, if you would like to begin by just telling us a little bit about one theory of ethics, utilitarianism. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so utilitarianism, as a way to find out what's right and wrong, focuses on the consequences of our actions. In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill called utilitarianism what would bring the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest number of people. Happiness is measured in terms of duration, intensity, and the amount of unhappiness it avoids. We can also divide utilitarianism into act and rule, where act utilitarianism considers the happiness generated by a particular action, judging this on its own, and rule utilitarianism tries to decide which action will create the greatest happiness in all situations and can be applied in many circumstances.
Thank you. So we're going to look at that as a way of working out what's right and wrong in discussion of particular issues. And the other theory that we're going to look at is what's sometimes called a more duty-based theory of ethics. So rather than looking at, well, as utilitarianism does, the consequences of our actions, and really asking, well, what will best bring about particular consequences for most people, instead a duty-based theory of ethics does something a little bit different. And David, could you say a little bit about what a duty-based theory of ethics is?
Yeah, so rather than focusing on the consequences of our actions and what really results from what we do, a duty-based ethics tends to look more about sort of if there's something inherently right or wrong about a particular action. So instead of sort of considering whether in principle something can be considered right or wrong. And an example of this is the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who came up with this principle that says that basically the right thing to do is always to act how we would wish everyone else to act in our situation. So this is essentially saying that in principle is right, and it's not really looking at the consequences as utilitarianism is.
Right, so it's looking more at rules, and it's saying, so what is right is to be judged by a definite rule, and Kant really tried to tie all the rules together and say that we should really consider this idea that, well, something is either right or wrong based on the question, well, would we want everyone to act in this way or not? What would the world be like if everyone acted in a particular way? All right. Well, we're going to look at to really try and apply some of these ideas at some specific things to do with, for example, starting the riots. And we're going to look especially because something that came up in a discussion about the riots was police behaviour, the use of force by the police. So the first thing that we're going to think about is the extent to which police should use force in a situation of civil unrest, in a situation that is riotous, when it's right to use force, what type of force is right, when it's not right. And so I'd like to sort of really throw this open to any of you really. Who would like to sort of start off and say something about, whether or not you think force is possibly right or not right in the situation of the riots of the summer? Nicole, would you like to say a little bit about what you think about this?
Sure. I'll start by saying something quite controversial, and I don't think that force should be used in any circumstances, because I think that using force would only breed violence, and that would make the situation 1,000 times worse.
Okay. But if we take this a bit further, I mean, does that mean that the police therefore can't arrest someone who is shoplifting or setting fire to something? I mean, so what exactly does it mean that they can't use force, just to get at that a bit more?
The only thing is, I think that if they use force, and if you allow violence to be applied in certain circumstances, then you're allowing the authority to manipulate the system and using loopholes, and then getting excuses to allow them to use that violence.
Okay, let's... Lawrence, what are you thinking?
Well, I feel like it's actually quite necessary for the police to have certain abilities to use force or aggression, because if people didn't have the law to protect them, they'd take matters into their own hands. And I think the police can easily be controlled as a kind of governmental jurisdiction. They can easily have rules to dictate their behaviour, but individuals can't to a certain extent. And so I think it's more dangerous for you to allow lawlessness, because I feel like then there's always going to be individuals who are willing to use more extreme measures to protect their property or their families.
All right, so your point is that the police can be regulated, that they are being watched carefully, and whereas individuals don't have that same light on them, really, in that sense, and therefore the police should be allowed to use force, but so long as it's carefully regulated. Amy, what do you think about this?
I guess what Nicole is saying is that, kind of in the context of Kantian ethics, like, on principle violence is wrong and there's no kind of exception to that rule that anyone could come up with. But I think I'd disagree, because this is the point of what we're debating. We have to, I think there has to be some people in society who can use force to restrain people, because otherwise, people would be able to do whatever they want. But what is important to find out is what's reasonable force.
And can we get a bit further along the line about this then? How do we distinguish reasonable from less reasonable force? David?
I think the main thing that we have to consider here is what the actual purpose of the police is, and sort of why we should allow them to use force if we're going to say that they can. And I think the purpose, surely, of the police has to be not just to sort of arrest people and punish them after crime has been committed, but also to try and prevent the greatest amount of crime possible. Because this is ultimately their purpose, to serve society in this way. And I think that if violence is a way of them doing that, I mean, obviously it's not... I wouldn't say that it's ideal, but I think that in some situations it could be called necessary.
Right.
Can I bring it back to the riots? I mean, this is a general discussion about whether police should be using violence or not. But in the particular case of the riots, what do people think, that the violence used there was overused, or should they have had more power, or what do they think?
Amy?
Well, I think in the context of the riots, something that was being debated a lot was the use of water cannons, and I don't think it was, and I think I really agree with that, because one of the things about water cannons is that it's kind of a blanket punishment that I wouldn't consider it reasonable force, because it punishes the majority for the sake of kind of trouble being caused by a minority. So I'd argue that that wouldn't have been necessary, because, it's unfair to the minority. To the majority, sorry.
All right. So it's a bit indiscriminate in that sense. Layla, what do you feel about that?
Well, whilst I agree with Amy in that this kind of punishment kind of is a blanket thing, and it kind of it punishes the majority when actually there might only be a minority being involved that deserve to be punished. It's it's easy to say that, but actually at the time when something needs to be done quickly and there's probably not a lot of time and there's not a lot of resources that the police can use, there's actually something needs to be done immediately, and something to this can actually have great effect.
So, in a way, this is sort of looking at sort of consequences a little bit, saying, you know, if some violence needs to be clamped down upon very effectively, very quickly, then even if it goes against some principles that we might have about non-violence, or principles that we might have about fairness, so we should only punish people who are actually involved in shoplifting or whatever, that all the same, because things can get more out of hand if you don't come down quite firmly, some would say that therefore that's the justification of it. Lawrence, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think I agree with Layla to a certain extent, and just kind of expanding on her point, I feel like the only other kind of valuable alternative to using direct action to stop crime would be kind of prohibiting people's civil rights. So if you didn't directly stop the crime itself and you were looking for a more preventative measure, you're going to be looking at things like restricting people's right to protest, restricting people's rights like freedom of speech. And I think that's kind of, well, really dangerous, actually. I feel like using a kind of a deterrent like a water cannon, which, yeah, it might be indiscriminate, but at the same time it's completely humane. I mean, there's never been any casualties or fatalities. So I feel like that would be a much more kind of valuable option than restricting people's civil rights.
All right, so your point is that water cannon is reasonable, because if that means that we kind of preserve people's right to protest as long as it's peaceful, then yeah, David?
Yeah, I'd agree with what Lawrence said, and I'd add that especially in a situation such as the riots, where civil disorder was occurring on such a huge scale, like the police were stretched incredibly thin and needed some way of preventing crime as efficiently as possible, because, you know, the civil disorder was happening across the whole of London and, you know, in other cities as well. And ultimately, if the purpose of the police is to prevent crime and they are stretched so thin, I think they would have to I think they should have resorted to a measure such as water cannons, which will, you know, just... I mean, it is indiscriminate, and it's unfortunate that we have to punish a majority in that way, but ultimately we have to think about sort of the greater good of society in quite a utilitarian way and consider...
But perhaps someone wants to say something about how perhaps looking at the consequences, looking at utilitarianism, means that actually there might be very bad consequences from water cannon. Would someone like to say something about that? Amy, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think I'd argue that if we take a utilitarian point of view, the harm that would have been done by using water cannons would be that, you know, people would resent the extreme force used by the police, and it would kind of inflame the situation even more. And so, whereas before you had a minority of people who were causing violence and seeking harm, that would kind of grow, and you might even get more harm done. Can I also say, I disagree with something that I think Lawrence said, which was that the alternative would be to reduce liberty, but I'd say that by using a water cannon, that's reducing people's liberty equally, because you're saying that anyone who wants to go out and protest peacefully can't do that either, because they're going to be punished in the same way as someone who wants to go out and protest violently.
Nicole, what are your thoughts about this?
I agree with David that crime should be prevented, but there's no evidence and there's no way of knowing that if we use water cannons or any other form of force, that this would actually prevent further riots or it would in any way help the situation.
David, you raised this, so what's your response to that?
I think that in the situation that we're discussing, in the riots, we have to consider, in some ways, two different groups of people. We're considering people who are out in the riots and taking a part in the demonstrations, whether they were peaceful or not. And we also have to consider the victims of the crime that happened. Now, people who went out to be involved in the riots would obviously have known that there was a fairly strong likelihood that they were going to turn violent. And if someone is willing to go out and protest in this manner, then I think surely we have to consider more and put a greater emphasis on the possible harm done to completely innocent victims who had no intention of causing any harm to anyone else. Obviously, at the start of the riots, perhaps, some people had the intention of protesting peacefully, but I think as they went further on, I think fewer and fewer people had that intention, and so I think that we have to consider more the harm done to people who are completely innocent than to those who aren't.
So this is quite a utilitarian sort of way of thinking, because you're weighing up here the consequences of harm for people owning shops and owners of property compared with the harm that may be done to people who have no ill intention but happen to be around on the streets, who are the victims of water cannon. And you're saying that actually that their well-being and discomfort is that we should consider that them a little less than we should consider those people who are owners of property and so on. Can we pursue this any further, this particular sort of calculation, or is this the wrong question, really? Amy?
I'd say that what David's saying is quite risky, because if you start, preempting people's intentions before they've even set out to the riots, or I don't think we can presume that everyone who is taking part in a protest has, violent intentions, because I'm sure that they didn't even know that they would have violent intentions. And I think it's, one of the most important things that we have, which is that you can't condemn someone until they've actually done something. So you can't take away people's liberties because of what they're likely to do.
Yes, Lawrence, what are you thinking about this?
But just kind of on that point about stopping people from doing things which they potentially might not do, I almost feel like in many respects that's kind of what would have to happen if you didn't use a certain level of force. Because if you're talking about using preventative measures rather than direct action against people who are in the act of committing crimes, you're effectively legitimising police arresting people before they have committed those crimes, which did in fact happen during the riots and was something which happened widely. And I feel like that's definitely something to be condemned far more than using action against people who are in the act of committing a crime or have been witnessed directly, attacking someone's property. I think that's definitely a worse thing.
Okay, David?
I'd also like to add that in some circumstances, I think we already do punish people before they've committed a crime. I mean, why is drunk driving a crime? It's not because the person has done any harm to anyone else yet, but it's because they're likely to do if they're behind the wheel of a car and drunk. So to say that, we can't really punish anyone before they've actually done anything, I think part of the purpose of the police is to prevent crime and preempt crime, which is just as important as punishing people after they've done it.
Is it a fair comparison? Because you might actually say of someone who is drink driving that they know that they have limited their capacity to do something such that things are therefore very dangerous, whereas someone who happens to be walking home and walks into a riot and doesn't know about it, there's a greater innocence about that. Is that fair?
Well, I think that sort of in the situation of the riots, I mean, I don't think anyone could claim to be out on the streets and not know about them. I think they were pretty well publicised.
All right.
Okay. We're going to go to a track now. This is going to be The Clash and Ghetto Defendant.
Starved in Metropolis, hooked on Necropolis, addict of Metropolis, do the worm on Acropolis, slam dance Cosmopolis, enlighten the populace. hooked in
She spent a
necropolis.
lifetime deciding how to run from it.
Addict of
Once fate
necropolis.
had a witness, and the years seem like friends.
Girlfriend.
Now a child has a dream, but it begins like it ends.
Shot in eternity. Methadone kitty. Iron serenity.
Ghetto defender, it is heroin pity. Not tear gas, no baton jar, that stopped you taking the city.
Strung out committee.
Wall out of the city, cloud down from uptown. Spray pest from the nest, run out to party or
The
town.
guards are itchy.
Forced to watch at the feast, then sweep up the night. Flipped pieces of coin,
Broken bottles.
exchange for birthright.
Drafted in a jiffy.
Ghetto defender, it is heroin pity.
Strung out committee.
Not tear gas, no button jar, will stop you taking the city.
Not sitting pretty. Drafted in a jiffy.
Heroin pity. Not tear gas, no button jar, will stop you taking the city. The ghetto prince of ghetto poets was bounced out of the room.
John Rambo.
But the bodyguards agree for disturbing the tune.
1873.
His words like flamethrowers,
Paris Commune.
burn the ghettos in their chests. His face painted whiter, then he was laid to rest.
Died in Marseille.
Ghetto defender,
Buried in
it
Charleville.
is heroin pity. Not tear gas, no baton jar, stop you taking the city.
Shut up.
Hello, this is Grant Bartley from Philosophy Now magazine, and you're listening to the Philosophy Now radio show. And today we're talking about contemporary ethics, if you want to put it like that. I have with me John Holroyd and some of his students from St Dunstan's College, who are they're 17-year-old and they've been studying philosophy, so this is some of the fruits of their study. And at the moment we're talking about the riots. So, John, if you want to continue.
Yes, one issue that came up really from the riots was really after them, the convictions that were given out to people for shoplifting and for arson. And a point that came from that was that the convictions seemed to be harsher than they were for the same crimes committed in quite different situations at different times. Some people have said that that's not fair, and others have said, well, there were good reasons why the convictions, the penalties should have been harsher than they were at other times. So let's get a view about that from our students. Our students again are Amy, Nicole, Layla, Lawrence and David. And what did you feel about this issue that harsher penalties seem to have been given out to people who committed crimes during the riots than those same crimes at different times? Layla, would you like to say something about your thoughts about that?
I think in terms of the punishments for those involved in the riots and those committing the same crimes or similar crimes who weren't involved in the riots, I think it's really a matter of intention, and it's also a matter of the amount of harm, if we can kind of measure it in any sort of way, the amount of harm that's caused to society and the surrounding people.
Right. Could you say a little bit more about that, or could anyone else say a little bit more about that? What is it about the intention, perhaps, that means that that could be reason to give people a more difficult, a harsher punishment, really? David?
I think the point is that the intention behind someone committing a crime during the riots is far more dangerous in some ways to society, because the intention is to exploit what is in fact a very vulnerable situation. And you know, if you have to draw a comparison between someone who will attack society when it's at its weakest and someone who won't, then I think you'd have to say that the former is far more dangerous.
Right. So it's the consequences as well as the intention. Right. Excellent. Yeah, Amy.
I think I disagree that the intention would be worse during a riot, because I'd imagine that in that kind of situation, someone would be a lot more opportunistic when committing a crime. I mean, if a shop has already been broken into and you're looking at that individual's like participation in it, then they might just be passing by thinking, oh well, if it's already going on, like, I'll just steal it, I may as well. But I mean, if you look at someone who did it in complete kind of isolation, it would take a lot more premeditation. They'd have to, you know, find out when would be the best time to steal from the shop and things like that. So I'd argue that the intention would be worse, not during the riot.
So does that mean that you think that the people who looted during the riot should get less of a sentence because they were more impulsive?
I think you need to look at them in kind of separated circumstances. So although they had, I don't think they're really...
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, that idea of being impulsive, and perhaps one point is that we're looking at averages. Yeah. That generally people were given harsher punishments. That's just by the law of averages, but not everyone was. And perhaps your point, Amy, is that, well, yeah, we should look at sort of individual cases. And there was the case, for example, of someone who said, I didn't know what came over me. Now, we might just kind of laugh at an excuse like that, but some people perhaps, yes, did, their worst part of their character took over, really, and exposed a weakness of character. But let's explore this a bit more. Lawrence, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think I'd disagree with David on the idea that because their collective actions caused greater harm to society, their punishments should be greater. Because I think that kind of goes against what's at the core of like a fair and just judicial system. I mean, you can't judge an individual's crimes based on the fact that a lot of other people were doing the crime at the same time. It just doesn't work, and it's not fair, and it's not democratic. You have to judge each individual's crime in isolation based on the fact that they committed that crime. And yeah, I kind of agree with Amy about how in many respects their intention was almost less because of their opportunism. And I think if you look at criminal law in general, opportunistic criminals are generally treated much more leniently in terms of their sentences. So it's almost like a raw reversal, which has happened with the riots. It's kind of bizarre.
So would you generally say, Lawrence, that you think that that the judicial system got it wrong in, generally speaking, giving harsher penalties to people because people's intentions were perhaps more innocent and more impulsive as opposed to premeditated? So you generally think that they should have got less of a sentence?
Yes.
Okay. David?
I think the problem with that argument is that you're not really comparing crimes during the riots with the crimes committed during other times. You're comparing opportunistic crime committed normally with premeditated crime committed normally. What I mean by this is that the opportunistic crime not committed during times of civil unrest is, I think, as you say, has much less intention behind it than premeditated crime. The problem is during the riots, people will have gone out onto the streets with the intention of at least taking some part in these riots and taking a part in attacking society when it's at its most vulnerable. And the problem with this is that whether or not they intended to commit crime itself, they still had the intention of causing harm to society in some way.
Is there some punishment that's also due because of character traits like cowardice? You might say, someone who is opportunistic, who takes advantage of the fact that the shop windows are already broken and they can just nip in and take a 42-inch TV, that's to be punished precisely because it looks as if they can get away with it. It's much more difficult to plan a premeditated crime. And society perhaps needs to give a very strong disincentive to opportunistic crime, precisely because there's a kind of cowardice involved, and that kind of human weakness is something that perhaps many people are vulnerable to, and therefore needs all the more a deterrence to be put against it. Layla, what are you thinking about that?
Well, whilst I understand the reasoning behind that, and I somewhat agree with it, that the punishments were perhaps harsher because they need to act as a deterrent so that this kind of civil unrest doesn't kind of happen again, I would say that it's kind of it seems
okay. Nicole, what are you thinking?
I don't think it's fair to punish people because they committed something that's considered a cowardly action, because we've never punished people on aspects of their personality before. So I don't think we should start doing that now.
Right. We've never punished people for aspects of their personality.
Yeah, we've never punished people for having...
I think they were shot in the war for cowardice in the First World War, certainly.
But not in the society we live in today. You're not shot for having a lack of courage or for...
And neither should you be, really.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Anyone sort of say anything, kind of in opposition to what's been just said? The character traits. David?
I think I do agree that punishments are necessary to serve as a deterrent in this situation. I don't necessarily agree with the sort of character aspect of it. I think, again, I take a utilitarian perspective and look at the consequences. I mean, as I understand it, the justification behind the harsher sentences is to serve as a deterrent so the riots did not continue. And I think that surely is the justification, rather than punishing people because the acts are cowardly. Although I mean, I think that they are, and I think that, as I've said, exploiting vulnerable situations is to be punished. I think the main justification is to serve as a deterrent to others, so they don't even consider the type of opportunistic crime that these people are being punished for.
Layla?
I think the bottom line is there can't really be a two-tiered form of law, and that a crime is a crime, and if it's committed in one circumstance, it has to be treated the same as if it was committed in another. And I think it has to be as black and white as that for kind of a law system to work out.
Right, we'd need a lawyer here to really help us with that. But we might explore that further. Amy?
I just go back to what David said about kind of the utilitarian and kind of it would prevent more harm. But I think this is really where utilitarianism comes across a really big problem.
Sorry, utilitarianism, for those who have just joined us, is the doctrine that things should be done to maximise the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people.
Yeah, so David is saying the greatest amount of happiness will come because people would be deterred from carrying out more crimes. But equally, one could say it would cause greater unhappiness because people would be kind of outraged by higher punishments given to people for doing equal crimes, and you could, more violence could be carried out and you could cause more harm. So I think consequences isn't really a valuable way of looking at the situation because you can't predict the way people are going to act like that.
Right. So the problem is one of evidence really here. with utilitarianism that, where's the evidence really that more harm will be created in this situation, and it's speculative. It's that seems to be the problem. Lawrence?
Yeah, I just think that on David's point about the harsh punishments being used as a deterrent, I think we can pretty much prove from, many societies around the world that harsher punishments as a deterrent don't really work. I mean, if you look at countries with, for example, the death penalty, the United States has one of the highest crime rates in the Western world. It doesn't seem to deter people from taking more drastic kind of action in their crimes.
Yes, this is a question of, some big analogies, some big comparisons, and how do we know which comparisons to draw? David?
I would say that the comparisons that we're currently drawing are invalid because we're considering sort of aspects of things that happen during the riots with things that happen at sort of normal times. And in the context of the riots, the deterrent is there to prevent crime from continuing. It's already happening, which is the problem. We need to stop it from continuing. I would also add that we raised in the other issue the point that we live in a democracy, and I would say that the majority of people were calling for harsher punishments, and I think at some point the government has to just sort of put their foot down and say, okay, the game is up, our citizens have asked for this, and this is the only way we're going to be able to stop further crime from continuing.
But if this is a moral discussion, this does raise questions about democracy because, after all, Hitler was democratically elected, and because this is what the majority want. Is that, as such, a moral point, that because the majority want it, that therefore there's a moral kind of reason there somehow? David, have you got any thoughts about that?
I think perhaps not, but ultimately that is the ideology, the ideology that our society is founded on, and unless we're going to get into the issue of questioning that, then I think for the time being we sort of have to accept it.
Okay, that's interesting.
Okay, and we're going to go to another track now. This is one for the Travellers. It's One Way by the Levellers.
There's only one way of life, and that's your own, your own, your My father when I was younger took me up onto the hill. and 11 laughs, 7 days on the underpass. The noise we thought would never stop died a death as the punks grew up. We choked on all our dreams, we wrestled with our fears. We're running through the heartless concrete streets, chasing our ideas. Run!
Hello, I'm Grant Bartley from Philosophy Now magazine, and you're listening to the Philosophy Now radio show. I have with me John Holroyd and various of his students. We're talking about ethics, and we're going to be talking about ethical issues resulting from the Dale Farm Travellers. That music you just heard was the Levellers and One Way, by the way. Okay, John?
Thank you. Well, one thing that's come up from the Dale Farm Travellers site near Basildon is the issue of people living different lifestyles and the amount of tolerance that people should have for different people's lifestyles. And so let's just look at that sort of issue, the question of to what extent people should be allowed to live lifestyles that inconvenience other people, because it's a wider issue in society, this question of lifestyles that inconvenience others. Perhaps things need to do far more than inconvenience others for us to be in any way intolerant. So how far should lifestyles that people find difficult be allowed in society? Lawrence, would you like to start off and tell us a little bit about your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just in general, for like a society to be interesting, it has to be diverse. And in a diverse society, you're always going to get people whose ideals conflict with each other and whose lifestyles conflict. There's always going to be people who disagree with other people's lifestyles. And I think it's pretty dangerous for a government which is meant to represent all the people and all the different ways of life to kind of favoritise one, or maybe even kind of say that one is less than, which I feel like is definitely kind of happening in many respects to the traveller community. Their lifestyles become sidelined in the kind of past few decades, with a lot of legislation being revoked, which is making the travelling aspect of their lifestyle increasingly difficult.
Could you give any example of that, of legislation?
Well, there was an act which used to be in place, which basically made it the law that every single county had to have at least one place for travellers to be able to settle and build temporary homes or caravan sites, and that was revoked. And so now there's pretty much very limited places in the UK where travellers can do that legally.
All right, let's have some other views about this question of travellers' rights. And David?
I'd argue that the duty of government is first and foremost to protect its citizens and make sure they are able to live their lifestyles. I think that obviously we can't encourage people to live totally opposing and sort of inconveniencing lifestyles. But if in some ways, again, it's quite a utilitarian point that I'm making here. But the government has to consider how sort of the whole of society lives their lifestyles.
Right. So can we talk about some specifics? Some, at what point do we say, well, this is too much? And are there any examples here? I mean, building caravans or chalets on greenbelt land, without planning regulation is understood by some to be an inconvenience. Amy, what do you think about this?
Yeah, so I think this whole discussion is kind of about what the meaning of inconvenience is, because I agree you have to allow each person to live in the way that they want, and I think that that's one of the main things that the government has to do. But as soon as living the way they want begins to harm others, or that's the point at which you need to say, well, that's an unacceptable lifestyle. But it's whether in this case living the way that they want to do is actually harming others, or if it's the idea of them harming is kind of out of a stereotyping or preconceptions that aren't necessarily right.
Right, so what you're perhaps saying is that, well, harm, it might be as much in someone's mind as it might be actually in reality, perhaps. Layla?
I think there's a sort of problem where we're talking about harming others in this circumstance. If you're talking about harming others in terms of being in kind of areas that they're not legally supposed to be in, I think there's a problem because they don't intend to set out to harm, and they are there because of what Lawrence said, because the local councils don't provide any other spaces for them to be in.
Right, so we can't see people's actions as separate from the circumstance, the context in which they live. If all right, David?
I think just to sort of draw some points together, I think the ultimate thing that we're saying here is that we shouldn't really allow people to live lifestyles that inconvenience others. Instead, we should allow them to live their lifestyles in a way that doesn't inconvenience others. And if the legislation that that counties had to provide an area for travellers to settle had not been revoked, then travellers would be able to live their lifestyles in a way that didn't affect other people as much as it's doing now, and we wouldn't have this problem.
Right, so that comes back to Lawrence's point. Amy?
But then I think if we take a kind of duty-based approach to this, the fact is you can't have people living on land that isn't theirs, because if everyone did that, then, society wouldn't work. So, if we follow that line, then surely it's right for them to be evicted, because you have to follow the law through so that everyone doesn't do it.
So we're still in the context, things may be imperfect, that the government doesn't provide more sites, but still here we are, and if they've broken the law, then there need to be consequences. Lawrence?
Yeah, I think just on that point about the law and whether or not they're kind of breaking the law and whether they should be punished for that, I feel like it's a kind of a controversial question, but I think it's important to maybe consider that the government's legislation is perhaps discriminatory on, many different. You could argue that the travellers are an ethnic community, a cultural minority, and I think maybe potentially it is discriminatory for those. For the reasons that I mentioned earlier, and I feel like the traveller community has faced huge amounts of prejudices, in this country from kind of local communities which they try to coexist with, and I feel like that's probably actually playing a fairly large part in what the government was doing.
Right, David?
I think coming back to what Amy said, the problem with duty-based ethics is that it's so prone to come up with two different rules or duties that are completely contradictory. Amy said that we think we should have as a rule that people shouldn't live on land which isn't theirs, and I think in some ways we have to say yes, that's right. That just, it feels right to us. But on the other hand, we do have to say that the travellers in some ways sort of, I think we would also say that it's wrong of the government to leave people with nowhere to live. I think in some ways the travellers would be feeling given up on, even let down by the government, and that's obviously something that should never happen.
Right. Can we reach any conclusions then, as we come towards the end, that about duty-based ethics and utilitarianism? Because we've been really using these approaches to what's right and wrong throughout the programme. But, you've just sort of, David, suggested that one problem then with duty-based ethics is which rules and what do we do when rules contradict each other. Is there anything that we've come across that is a similar or a problem for utilitarianism, really? Let's have some thoughts about that. Amy?
I think what we said in our previous discussion was that utilitarianism in some circumstances has to rely on predicting people's behaviour, and that's kind of almost impossible, and the process of working out what would cause the most harm is extremely difficult.
Yes, because we've got to speculate there. Yeah. Any other thoughts about either duty-based ethics or a utilitarianism at this point?
Stop here. Utilitarianism is, again, the idea that we should act to promote the greatest happiness or the greatest benefit in society, whereas there are other ethics, such as you should act out of moral laws or without ideas of consequences.
David?
The main problem that I personally have with utilitarianism is that it seems to imply that we can sort of, quantify human emotion and sort of, in some ways, even measure it mathematically. It seems to be implying that, we can measure the outcomes of what will happen if we do this and what will happen if we do the other thing. And I just think that that's vastly underestimating the sort of complexity, and I don't think you can ever think of enough variables that would make utilitarianism work for all circumstances.
Nicole?
I was going to say one of the difficulties with the duty-based ethics is the idea that it's very much controlled by reason. Sorry. And when we're discussing these issues like the Dale Farm and the riots, a lot of it has to do with morality, and morality can't always be expressed through reason.
Right. Any further point about that? That's quite interesting, that maybe emotion is quite involved in an understanding of what's right and wrong. Amy?
I had, something to say, kind of another criticism of duty-based ethics, which is that I'm not sure if it came up in our argument about the police, but by nature it doesn't allow for any exceptions. But I would argue that in society, police are kind of the ultimate exception to the rule that violence is wrong, if that were to be a rule we decided, because, you have to have someone who is going to carry out violence on behalf of other people.
Yes, and there seems to be at least some irony if they are supposed to be enforcing the rules for everyone else. Is that part of your point?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I think we'll have to finish there because we're coming to the end of the show. Well, thanks, John, and thanks to the people of St Dunstan's College. Just each of you say your name.
David.
Lawrence.
Ayla.
Nicole.
Amy.
Yeah, and we've been discussing ethics. Next week, we're going to be talking about Freud's civilization and its discontents and its contemporary relevance. And I'm Grant Bartley from Philosophy Now magazine. You're invited to go to philosophynow.org, which is our website, and there's a forum there, and please subscribe to the magazine. And my books, please buy my brilliant books. That's The Meta-Revolution and Love, Solitude and Destruction, which you can get online. And we're going to end with Disposable Teens by Marilyn Manson.